People think Marilyn Monroe's fear began at Cal Neva. They think something happened there in the summer of 1962 that broke her forever. That's not true. Cal Neva didn't create Marilyn's fear. It exposed it. Because long before the fame, long before Hollywood, long before powerful men and locked doors, Marilyn Monroe lived with a constant, invisible fear. Not the fear of death, not the fear of scandal, but the fear that the world was never safe and never would be. And once you understand where that fear came from, Cal Neva stops looking like a mystery and starts looking like the inevitable final collision. This is the story of what Marilyn Monroe was afraid of long before Cal Neva. Before Marilyn Monroe became a symbol, she was a child named Norma Jeane, a child who never learned what safety felt like. Her earliest memories weren't of comfort or protection, they were of instability, of adults disappearing, of being moved from one place to another without explanation or warning. She didn't grow up wondering who she would become, she grew up wondering where she would end up next. And that difference matters more than almost anything else when you're trying to understand what happened decades later. In trauma psychology, there's a concept called baseline security. It's the foundational belief a child develops about whether the world is fundamentally safe or dangerous. Most children absorb this belief without ever thinking about it. They learn it through repetition, through consistency, through the presence of adults who stay. Norma Jeane never absorbed that belief. Her nervous system learned one lesson early, and learned it well. Nothing lasts, no one stays, and comfort can be taken away without warning or reason. That belief didn't fade with age, it didn't soften with success. It became the foundation of her entire emotional life. By the time she was 5 years old, her brain had already decided something crucial about reality. The world is not safe, people leave, and survival means staying alert, staying compliant, staying ready for the next loss. This wasn't a choice. It wasn't a personality trait. It was neurological wiring that formed before she had language to describe it. And once that wiring sets, it doesn't just disappear because circumstances improve. It stays, quiet, persistent, shaping every relationship, every decision, every moment of perceived safety for the rest of her life. Between 1926 and 1935, Norma Jeane was moved between foster homes and orphanages more than a dozen times. Each move came with the same unspoken message: you don't belong here permanently, you are temporary, you are borrowed. For most children, home is where you return. For Norma Jeane, there was no return, there was only the next placement, the next family, the next set of rules she had to learn quickly or risk being sent away again. When a child experiences repeated abandonment, the brain adapts, not in dramatic ways, in quiet, permanent ones. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, becomes overactive. The body stays in a low-level state of alertness even when there is no immediate danger. Trust becomes conditional, fragile, something that feels dangerous to give fully because it has been broken too many times before. This isn't about being damaged, it's about survival. The brain is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's protecting the child from future harm by staying ready for the next loss. But here's what most people don't understand. That protection system doesn't turn off when the danger ends. It keeps running. In adulthood, it shows up as hypervigilance, as difficulty relaxing into relationships, as the belief that closeness will inevitably lead to abandonment. Marilyn didn't grow up learning how to relax into love. She grew up learning how to monitor it, to watch for signs that it was ending, to prepare for the moment when someone would stop choosing her. Every bond felt temporary. Every connection felt borrowed. Every moment of comfort came with the unspoken question, when will this end? By the time she reached adulthood, her nervous system was already shaped by loss. Hollywood didn't break her. It met her already fractured. And every relationship that followed, every contract she signed, every man who claimed to love her, walked into a system that had been wired for fear long before they arrived. Being desired was never the same as being safe. As Marilyn grew older, something confusing happened. People wanted her, intensely, constantly, obsessively. From the outside, it looked like power. Men stopped in the street. Photographers followed her. Studios offered contracts. Attention poured in from every direction. but from the inside, it felt like exposure, because attention had never meant protection in her life. It had meant scrutiny, control, expectation. For someone with Marilyn's history, desire was not a compliment, it was a demand. When men looked at her, she didn't feel seen, she felt studied, evaluated, objectified in ways that reminded her of every system that had treated her as temporary property. Love and danger were never separate experiences for her. They were always tangled. Affection came with conditions. Closeness came with the risk of being consumed. Being wanted didn't make her feel chosen. It made her feel owned. This is why Marilyn often confused affection with threat, not because she was broken, but because her past taught her that closeness came with consequences. The foster father who touched her when she was 8 years old didn't call it violence, he called it affection. The photographers who told her to pose in ways that made her uncomfortable didn't call it exploitation, they called it opportunity. By the time she reached Hollywood, her nervous system couldn't distinguish between admiration and danger. They had always arrived together, and Hollywood didn't help. It reinforced the pattern. Beauty was currency, sexuality was leverage, compliance was rewarded, resistance was punished. The message was clear: your body is not yours, your time is not yours, your boundaries are negotiable, and if you want to survive here, you learn to say yes even when everything inside you is screaming no. Hollywood didn't create the fear, it confirmed it. Hollywood in the 1950s operated on a simple principle: stars were property. Studios owned contracts that controlled when actors worked, what roles they played, how they dressed, who they dated, and when they rested. For most actors, this was frustrating. For Marilyn, it was re-traumatization, because once again she was in a system where powerful people made decisions about her body without asking her permission. Once again, she was being moved from place to place, project to project, without control over her own life. Once again, survival meant compliance. The contracts were explicit. 20th Century Fox could loan her out to other studios. They could suspend her without pay if she refused a role. They could dictate her weight, her hair color, the shape of her body, and if she resisted, there were consequences. Lost income, bad press, the threat of being replaced. For someone whose entire childhood taught them that resistance leads to abandonment, this environment didn't feel new. It felt horribly familiar. Hollywood promised transformation, but what it delivered was reinforcement. She was admired but not protected, celebrated but not secure, desired but never safe. The power dynamics were identical to the ones she had survived as a child. Different faces, different buildings, same fundamental truth. Her value was conditional, her place was temporary, and the moment she stopped being useful, she would be discarded. This is why Marilyn couldn't just walk away. People often asked her why she didn't quit, why she didn't refuse the roles that hurt her, why she didn't stand up to the directors who treated her poorly. The answer was simple. Her nervous system didn't believe she could survive outside the system. Compliance had kept her alive as a child. And even though she was now an adult, even though she had money and fame and options, that belief remained. Saying no felt dangerous. Setting boundaries felt like suicide. So she stayed. And every time she stayed, the fear deepened. She couldn't say no, not because she was weak, because she was terrified. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Marilyn's life is her inability to refuse people. This is often misread as weakness, or manipulation, or lack of discipline. Some biographers have called her a people-pleaser. Others have suggested she used compliance as strategy. Both miss the point. Marilyn's inability to say no wasn't a personality flaw, it was a trauma response. For someone whose entire childhood taught them that love disappears when you resist, saying no feels existentially dangerous. It's not about wanting approval, it's about survival. When a child learns that compliance keeps adults from leaving, that lesson doesn't vanish in adulthood. It becomes the foundation of every relationship, the unspoken rule that governs every interaction. If I say no, they will leave. If I set a boundary, I will lose everything. By the time Marilyn reached her 30s, this belief was so deeply embedded that she often couldn't recognize her own limits. She would agree to work when she was exhausted. She would attend events when she was sick. She would go to places she didn't want to go, with people she didn't trust, because refusing felt more dangerous than enduring. Her nervous system wasn't asking, "Do I want this?" It was asking, "What happens if I refuse?" And the answer was always the same: I could lose everything. This is why Cal Neva mattered, not because it was the first time powerful men put her in an uncomfortable situation, but because it was the moment when her capacity to endure finally collapsed. When the gap between what she could tolerate and what she was being asked to endure became unbridgeable, and when that collapse happened, there was no foundation to catch her, because the foundation had never been built. Cal Neva wasn't a new trauma, it was the collision of all the old ones. The summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe was 36 years old. Her career was faltering, her marriages had failed, her reliance on medication had deepened, and then came the invitation to Cal Neva Lodge, a weekend retreat. Powerful men, private rooms, the same pattern she had survived dozens of times before. But this time, something was different. This time, her nervous system had nothing left. Cal Neva is often framed as a mystery. What happened that weekend? Who was there? What did they do? But those questions miss the deeper truth. What happened at Cal Neva wasn't new. It was the final repetition of a pattern that had been destroying her since childhood. Powerful people making decisions about her body. Environments where saying no felt impossible. Situations where escape required a kind of agency her nervous system no longer believed she had. For someone with Marilyn's history, Cal Neva wasn't just uncomfortable. It was the activation of every unresolved fear at once. Childhood abandonment, loss of control, inability to protect herself, the belief that survival required compliance even when compliance felt like death. And this time, there was no reserve left, no ability to compartmentalize, no capacity to endure and move forward. Her nervous system, which had been running on borrowed stability for decades, finally exhausted what little remained. This is why she didn't bounce back. This is why the weeks after Cal Neva were marked by increasing desperation. It wasn't because something uniquely terrible happened that weekend. It was because her entire system, which had been holding trauma at bay through sheer force of will, finally gave up. The fear she had been managing since childhood stopped being manageable. And when that happens, when the survival system that has kept you alive for 36 years suddenly stops working, there is no easy recovery. There is only collapse. Marilyn wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of being trapped. Marilyn Monroe wasn't afraid of death. In her final months, she talked about it often, sometimes with resignation, sometimes with curiosity, but never with the kind of terror that defined the rest of her life. What terrified her wasn't dying. It was living in a world where she never felt safe, where every relationship felt conditional, where every moment of peace came with the unspoken threat that it could be taken away. She was afraid of being trapped in systems that used her body without her consent, trapped in relationships where love felt like control, trapped in a public image that had nothing to do with who she actually was, trapped in a nervous system that no longer believed safety was possible. And once that fear became constant, once her body stopped believing escape was possible, her collapse became inevitable. This is the part of Marilyn's story that doesn't get told. Not the conspiracies, not the scandals, but the simple, devastating truth that she was a woman whose nervous system never learned how to rest, who spent her entire life waiting for the next abandonment, who believed deep in her bones that the world was not safe and never would be. Cal Neva didn't create that belief, it simply proved it one final time. Once you understand what Marilyn feared, the next question becomes unavoidable. Marilyn Monroe wanted one thing more than fame, more than beauty, more than success. She wanted to feel safe, and she spent her entire life searching for it, in marriages, in therapy, in the arms of men who claimed to love her. But it never came, not with Joe DiMaggio, not with Arthur Miller, not with the Kennedys, not with anyone. In the next video, we'll explore why. Why no relationship ever made her feel secure. Why every attempt to find safety ended in abandonment. And why the fear that began in childhood followed her into every connection she tried to build. Because Cal Neva was the end of a pattern that started long before Hollywood. And understanding that pattern is the only way to understand what really happened to Marilyn Monroe. If you haven't watched the Cal Neva series yet, start there, because this story only makes sense in order. And if this video changed the way you see Marilyn Monroe, subscribe, because this channel isn't about myths or conspiracies, it's about understanding what happens when trauma is never given a safe place to heal.